and tensions are rising between India and Pakistan after Islamabad said it used Chinese-made jets to shoot down 5 Indian fighter aircraft and 25 drones. Pakistan says the response came after Indian airstrikes targeted what New Delhi called terrorist sites inside Pakistan and Pakistan-controlled Kashmir. Joining us now is Kervin Okin, a former lead intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance coordinator for the U.S. Army, as well as the host of This Week Explained podcast. Always good to see you, Kervin. Thank you for joining us this morning. Now, India says it targeted Islamic cells following the deadly terrorist attack on its own citizens last month. Pakistan denies this. How do you interpret both of their messaging?
Well, once again, thank you for having me on. It's always a pleasure to be here. Look, this is not what the world needs right now. We've got a conflict in Ukraine. We've got tensions in the Middle East rising, and now Pakistan and India, 2 nuclear nations, could be escalating to a conflict. Now, this all started in Kashmir, where India said that a Pakistani-based Islamic extremist group fired on tourists and individuals in there, and that is why India is doing these strikes. India says they have credible intelligence of this. They're not releasing that intelligence because it is classified. So things are heating up there, and I don't see, according to their responses and their actions, I don't see things calming down, at least within this next week.
Now, how does the use of the Chinese-made military aircraft by Pakistan impact the regional balance of power as well as the international response?
Yeah, look, it's advancing Pakistan's Air Force right now. India's Air Force is much more advanced, and they have a bigger Air Force there, and they've been provided Western aircraft like the Rafale from the French. That was one of the alleged aircraft that was struck down. It would be the first time one of those aircraft had been shot down in a conflict since it had been produced. So you've got all this leading to the tensions, and it shows that Pakistan is leaning on China, much like Russia is doing, much like Iran is doing right now, to get this equipment. But look, they're also supplying drones. I think drones, obviously, that's the future of warfare here. I think paying a close eye on these medium altitude, long endurance, or long range, what we would colloquially call suicide drones being used in these regions. That's going to be something to look for in the next few weeks.
Now, obviously, conflicting messaging coming out of Pakistan and India, both pointing the finger at the other. I want to talk about military supply chain. You mentioned the supply of Chinese military equipment to Pakistan, with India having more advanced equipment. India's largest supplier of military equipment, by a small margin, is Russia, and then 80% of Pakistan's military equipment coming from China. How does that fall into the balance of all of this?
Yeah, right. It's an incredible series of events in geopolitics, right? Since the last few years, India has always been my wild card in all of this because they haven't taken a neutral standpoint, but they've been on the fence in all of this. They've been supported by the U.S., supported by China, as you said, supported by Russia. So what I think benefits the U.S. here is if they can get intelligence from India about how these aircrafts and how these munitions work on a land, surface to air, surface to surface missile capacity, and how Russia's weapons are being used and how China's weapons are being used effectively to defend that, that's going to help the United States in a future conflict with China.
Let's talk credibility. When Osama bin Laden was finally tracked down, he was well fortified within a mile of the Pakistani military academy, and he was supposedly there for 5 years before we sent in the SEALs. So their government never really answered for that. Does that lend any more credibility as to see who is being more forthright in what's actually happening over there?
Yeah, and look, and I was in Afghanistan when that happened, when the SEALs went into Islamabad and went into Pakistan to do this. And that was the fracturing of Pakistani-U.S. relations at that point. That was because Pakistan had no idea the U.S. was doing this. And obviously, we wouldn't know that. The people who were working on the bin Laden raid had no idea exactly what they were doing until the moment that they left. So that strained U.S.-Pakistan relations. That's the moment Pakistan turned more towards China to improve their military. And that's where we stand right here, where India has leaned more heavily on the French and the U.S. And Pakistan is now relying completely on China to support their operations.
She is in Moscow right now. India buys lots of equipment from Russia. Could oddly Russia play somewhat of a deal maker in this situation?
Yeah, look, Russia is oddly quiet right now. Obviously, they're dealing with their own stuff, and they've got a ceasefire in place that Ukraine says that they've, already gone against. So that's why Ukraine is firing on Moscow. But yeah, Russia could play a very large part of this. Like I keep saying, they're in a wartime economy. What's great for a wartime economy is to continue to export those munitions to other countries. So it'd be interesting to see if the U.S. backs India in this, if they force India to stop some of this importing of Russian munitions and Russian military equipment.
India, of course, part of the BRICS economic alliance, not military alliance. China and India have had tensions and warring on their border, not as intense as what's happening with Pakistan. What does China hope to gain by supplying arms to Pakistan?
Well, obviously, what you just mentioned, look, China and India are economically, they benefit each other economically with the BRICS group, which is kind of like the global south of NATO. But that is very much a economic reliance for those nations. But there is that border between India and China that has been disputed for years now. So China very well could be supplying Pakistan with these munitions, supplying Pakistan possibly with intelligence in order to degrade Indian military so that China can then make a play for that disputed border. That is obviously, that's absolutely in play right now.
And I just want to go back to the Russian component of this, because China and Russia, of course, have the quote, no limits partnership. So how do you expect things to advance? Are these dominoes? Does the Ukraine peace process then influence what happens with Pakistan, India? How does all of this sort of unfold?
Yeah, I think this is, as of right now, unless things escalate any further, this is right now just regional to Pakistan and India. But if it does explode, look, we're talking two nuclear powers. Russia is another nuclear power, China, a nuclear power, and the U.S., a nuclear power. I think you're going to see all of these nations come together, and none of these nations want to see something of that magnitude kick off here. So I do think Russia is going to play some mediation. Like I said, they're quiet right now, but they will play some mediation in order to possibly get certain capitulation from Ukraine because they helped in this sort of mediation between India and Pakistan.
And just in our last 30 seconds, you've been on the show before explaining China has an intention to invade Taiwan. Any regional conflict where one nation goes to the sovereignty of another country sort of fortifies that position. So is that something that you think China is looking at closely?
Yeah, absolutely. China's looking at the Kashmir area. Who's going to take control of that? How are they going to get that? If the audience doesn't know, Kashmir is a disputed area between Pakistan and India. They both claim sovereignty over that land, and that's usually where these conflicts kick off in that region because of that contention there. So China's going to be paying a close eye on how the rest of the world reacts around this if India or Pakistan makes a move to completely take over that Kashmir area.
Curvin Oken, host of This Week Explained podcast, thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you so much for having me, and stay safe out there.